It didn't begin with a kiss. It began with a silence. A look. A pause that carried more weight than any words ever could. Matthew had known Zach since their first year of college. Roommates at random, they'd started with passive nods and awkward silences, but somehow, over time, they'd become inseparable. They shared late-night burgers, failed exams, quiet walks through empty streets, and conversations that stretched until morning. It wasn't just friendship. It was something solid, steady, like gravity. Even after graduation, they never drifted apart. When jobs took them to the same city, they found apartments in the same building, 2 floors apart. Friday nights turned into routine, meeting at the same bar, ordering the same snacks, making fun of the same songs on the playlist. Nothing needed to be said. Everything already was. But something had shifted, slowly, quietly, so gradually that Matthew didn't realize it was happening until it already had. It began with how Zach started watching him during conversations, not with distraction, but with attention. How he sometimes leaned in a little closer when making a joke. How he stopped commenting on girls at the bar and instead just sat beside Matthew, eyes focused elsewhere. It wasn't obvious, but it was there. That evening had been no different. At least, it shouldn't have been. They'd walked home through the city, their sneakers hitting the pavement in rhythm. They laughed at the man, trying to dance to music only he could hear. They passed a pizza place, and Zach turned, smirking. Want to split one for nostalgia? Nostalgia? Matthew had raised an eyebrow. We ordered from there last week. Yeah, Zach said. Exactly. They laughed. Ordered. Ate sitting cross-legged on the floor of Matthew's living room like they were 20 again. And for a few moments, it was easy to believe that time hadn't moved forward. But then the laughter faded, and a strange quiet settled between them. Not the comfortable silence they were used to. This one buzzed with something unspoken. Matthew felt it in the way Zach's eyes lingered. The way he looked like he wanted to say something and kept swallowing it back. After a few minutes, Matthew stood up. I'm going to take a quick shower. Get the pizza smell off me. Sure, Zach said quickly. Go ahead. Matthew walked down the hall, turning the knob a little harder than necessary. Inside the bathroom, the steam rose quickly, coating the mirror. He stepped under the water and let it cascade over him, trying to wash away the static in his mind. But it didn't help. He kept replaying the look Zach had given him. Not because it was intense, but because it was honest. And because it didn't feel like the kind of look one friend gave another. He leaned forward, hands pressed against the cool tile, eyes closed. The moment felt suspended, as if something was holding its breath just outside the door. And then he heard it, the sound of the door opening. He turned sharply. Zach was standing in the doorway, not moving, not speaking, just standing there. The steam blurred the details, but there was no mistaking the look in his eyes. It wasn't fear. It wasn't confusion. It was quiet clarity. Matthew didn't say anything. His heart pounded louder than the shower. For a long second, nothing happened. Then Zach spoke, softly, his voice almost lost in the sound of the water. If I'm wrong, just tell me. Matthew looked at him, eyes steady. You're not, he replied. Zach nodded once, not dramatically, just enough to show he'd heard. Then he stepped back out and closed the door. The moment passed like a wave, not crashing, but receding slowly, leaving the room quiet again. Matthew stayed under the water longer than he needed to, not because he didn't know what to do, but because everything was suddenly different, and he needed a moment to breathe inside that difference. When he finally returned to the living room, Zach was on the couch, arms folded, a cushion clutched against his chest like armor. The TV played, muted, casting flickers of light across the room. Matthew sat down beside him, not touching but closer than before. Neither of them said anything for a while. The silence was thick, but not tense. It was the kind of silence that waited patiently, knowing something important was forming inside it. I shouldn't have come in, Zach said finally. You didn't do anything wrong, Matthew answered. Zach's voice trailed off. He stared straight ahead. It's been on my mind for a while. I thought maybe. Matthew interrupted him gently. You weren't the only one thinking about it. That made Zach pause. You weren't? He asked, voice barely above a whisper. Matthew shook his head. No, More silence. But this one carried something softer. Not fear, not pressure, just acknowledgement. I always thought if I said anything, I'd ruin everything, Zach admitted. I thought the same, Matthew said. But lately, it felt like pretending was the only thing ruining it. Zach nodded slowly. I didn't know if you'd be okay with it. Matthew exhaled. I didn't know if I'd be brave enough to say I was. They looked at each other then, not in a sudden, dramatic way, but as if they were finally meeting without anything between them. No labels, no explanations, just presence. I don't know what this means, Zach said quietly. Me neither, Matthew replied. But maybe we don't have to name it right now. Zach smiled faintly. Yeah, maybe we just sit with it. And that's what they did. They didn't hold hands. They didn't make promises. They just sat, shoulders close, as the world outside continued in its usual rhythm. Inside, something had shifted, and though neither of them knew what would happen next, they both understood that nothing was going back to how it was before. That night wasn't about decisions. It wasn't about declarations. It was about a door opening, literally and figuratively, and two people finally letting the silence speak for them. Matthew got up eventually and made them tea. He brought one cup over, set it down on the table, and offered the other to Zach. Thanks, Zach murmured. For the tea or the moment? Matthew asked. Zach smiled. Both. They sat again, sipping quietly. Occasionally, their eyes would meet, and one of them would look away, smiling for no reason. When it grew late, Zach stood to leave. He hesitated near the door. Matthew walked with him, standing in the frame. Good night, Zach said. Yeah, Matthew replied. Good night. But neither of them moved. Finally, Zach added, This wasn't a mistake, right? No, Matthew said. It wasn't. And Zach nodded, stepped into the hallway, and disappeared down the stairs. Matthew closed the door gently, then leaned his back against it. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The apartment was still the same, but nothing inside him was. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid to find out. The days that followed weren't loud. They weren't dramatic. They didn't come with sweeping declarations or late-night confessions. But they were different. Matthew felt it in the way silence had changed between them. It used to be background noise. Now, it carried meaning. Zach didn't avoid him. If anything, he came around more often. Not with urgency or need, but with presence. They didn't talk about what had happened in the hallway, or the moment in the steam, or even the way their eyes had met and nothing had broken. Instead, they returned to their old rhythms. Only now, every beat felt newly tuned. That week, they met up 3 times. Once for coffee, once for a walk along the river, once to help Zach move an old desk out of his apartment, even though it didn't really need moving. Matthew had smiled when Zach called. He didn't ask why. He knew the desk wasn't the point. Conversation stayed easy, familiar. They joked about their neighbors, groaned about rising rent, argued about which fast food fries were actually the best. On the surface, nothing had changed. But under it, everything had. Matthew noticed it in the way Zach sometimes stopped speaking mid-sentence, like his mind had gone somewhere quieter. In the way his laughter lingered after a joke, eyes still on Matthew. And in how he occasionally reached for his coffee with a hand that trembled, just barely, like the smallest part of him was unsure what world they were living in now. They didn't speak about what they were. There were no terms, no decisions, but their time together began to stretch longer. Lunches turned into whole afternoons. A quick stop for groceries became an aimless walk with no destination. One evening, they ended up at the edge of the park they used to visit during college. It wasn't planned. They'd started walking after dinner and kept going until they recognized the benches under the tall trees. Matthew paused, hands in his pockets. We haven't been here in years. Zach looked around. We came here that one summer when we both hated our internships. Matthew nodded. You tried to convince me to quit mine and come work at the comic shop with you. You almost did. Matthew smiled faintly. Yeah, almost. They sat on the same bench as before, facing the same worn path. The trees rustled softly overhead. Neither of them said much at first, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Zach broke the silence. I remember sitting here that night thinking, I hope we never drift apart. He paused. I didn't say it out loud. Thought it'd sound dramatic. Matthew looked over at him, the corners of his mouth lifting slightly. Would have meant something if you had. Zach nodded slowly. Maybe it's better I didn't. We might have gone home and laughed it off. Or you'd have stared at me like I was losing it. I wouldn't have, Matthew said, then hesitated. But maybe I wasn't ready to hear it. Another silence, but one filled with the warmth of memory. They sat for a long time, each quietly sorting through their thoughts. Not trying to force anything, just letting it settle. The next day, Zach sent a photo to Matthew's phone. It was the bench. Same angle, same time of day. Just a caption. That summer didn't end like I thought it would. But this one's not over yet. Matthew didn't reply. He didn't need to. Instead, he showed up at Zach's place that evening with 2 paper bags and said, "Dinner. I'm not taking critiques." Zach grinned. As long as there's no mushrooms, I'll survive. They ate on the floor like old times. No music, just the crinkle of wrappers and soft conversations that meandered from small talk to shared stories they hadn't told in years. Zach asked, "Do you remember that party our junior year? The one where you spilled orange soda on that guy's shoes?" Matthew groaned. "Don't remind me. You were so horrified." Kept apologizing. He was just happy someone talked to him. "I felt bad," Matthew said, then glanced over. "You were the one who told me to own it." Said confidence was louder than clumsiness. Zach shrugged. "I meant it. That was how it went for days, scattered memories, soft reminders. But the moments in between began to stretch out. Not in time, but in meaning. A glance held a second too long. A pause before goodbye. A half step closer when crossing the street. They were still not calling it anything. Still avoiding the obvious question. But the answer was there, breathing in the quiet between words. One afternoon, they sat on the rooftop of Matthew's building, watching the clouds drift. Zach had brought drinks. Matthew had brought chips. Neither of them said why they wanted to be up there. They just were. At one point, Zach said, "I've never really said this before, but I don't think I've had a friend who made me feel like I could exhale." Matthew tilted his head. "What do you mean?" Zach shrugged, then looked out over the buildings. "Like I wasn't trying. Like I didn't have to be the loudest person in the room, or the most interesting, or whatever. You never needed that from me." Matthew didn't respond right away. He leaned back, closed his eyes. "I think I always saw you that way, even when you were loud." They both laughed gently. It wasn't romance, not in the way movies showed it. It was something gentler, something unfolding without being pushed. The next evening, Matthew found himself in Zach's kitchen. He was cutting vegetables for tacos. Zach stood beside him, trying to organize ingredients and failing miserably. At one point, their hands brushed as they reached for the same bowl. Neither of them moved away, but neither said anything. Later, when the meal was done and the dishes were soaking, they sat on the couch with their legs stretched out in opposite directions. Zach's head rested against the back cushion. Matthew looked over, watching the city lights blink through the window. "Did you ever think we'd be here?" Zach asked, not moving. Matthew considered the question. "No, not like this. But you don't regret it?" Matthew shook his head. "Not even close." Zach didn't smile. He just looked back and nodded. And that meant more than a dozen perfect lines. Time passed like that, without pressure, without deadlines. They began spending evenings together more consistently. Not because they had to, but because it felt strange not to. They learned new things about each other, despite all the years. Favorite books, forgotten fears, old scars from childhood stories never told before. It became clear that silence between them wasn't silence at all. It was trust. It was space filled with unspoken understanding. But still, neither had said it out loud. One night, as rain tapped softly against the windows, they played cards at Matthew's place. Zach lost terribly and pretended to be outraged. Matthew rolled his eyes and tossed a pillow at him. Zach caught it and held it to his chest. "I think my luck's better in other areas." Matthew raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" Zach hesitated. "I think," he said slowly, "my luck's been showing up every day lately. Just hasn't had a name." Matthew's heart skipped. But still, neither of them named it. It didn't need naming. Not yet. Some truths didn't need to be forced into words to be real. They were already living it. In the way they showed up, the way they listened, the way every shared silence said, "I'm here. I see you." And maybe, just maybe, that was how love begins, not with a statement, but with the quiet courage to stay. Matthew didn't expect anything to change that night. That was the strange part. Everything had felt so steady, safe. They hadn't called it anything, hadn't drawn any lines around what they were becoming. But it felt real. It had felt like enough. Zach invited him to a small get-together. Just a few college friends passing through town, nothing formal. Matthew said yes without thinking. It made sense. They'd shared so many of those moments over the years. Old friends, familiar jokes, a place to belong. But from the moment they walked in, Matthew could feel it. Something was off. Zach moved through the room like he used to, like they hadn't grown at all. He laughed loudly, told stories he'd told a dozen times before, made everyone around him feel like they were the most interesting person in the world. That had always been his gift. But tonight, something about it didn't feel like Zach. It felt like a version of him, one carefully pulled from memory. Matthew stood nearby, talking to a few people he vaguely remembered, but he wasn't really in the conversation. His focus kept drifting. Not to what was being said, but to what wasn't. Zach hadn't acknowledged him once. Not really. Not in the way that mattered. There was a moment, brief but sharp, when someone joked that Matthew and Zach used to act like an old married couple back in school. Everyone laughed. Zach laughed too. He waved it off. Didn't even look at Matthew when he did it. That was when something inside Matthew shifted. He slipped out onto the balcony without saying anything. The night air was cool. Not cold, but enough to make him feel more awake than he wanted to be. He leaned on the railing and tried to breathe through the strange pressure building in his chest. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't anger. It was something quieter, heavier. Disappointment, maybe, or recognition. The door slid open behind him. "I figured I'd find you out here," Zach said. Matthew didn't turn. "It's quiet." Zach stepped up beside him. "Yeah." A long pause stretched between them. Matthew broke it first. "You didn't have to pretend we weren't close." Zach shifted. "I wasn't pretending." Matthew turned to look at him. "Weren't you?" Zach looked down at the floor for a moment. "I don't know what to say." "Then don't say anything," Matthew replied. "But I saw the way you avoided looking at me. I saw how you laughed that comment off like it was ridiculous. I didn't want to start something I couldn't explain." "You mean something you didn't want to explain?" Matthew said. Zach exhaled. "I haven't told my family. Not really. My sister's suspects, I think. But my parents, they wouldn't take it well. And a room full of old friends felt too close to that." Matthew crossed his arms. "So the solution was to act like I didn't matter?" Zach winced. "That's not what I meant. It's what it felt like." They stood in silence again. Not the kind they'd grown used to. This one stung. It was full of everything they hadn't figured out how to say. Zach tried again. "I've never done this before. I've never let anyone get this close." Matthew nodded slowly. "And now that I am, you're not sure what to do with me." Zach didn't argue. The ride home was short, but it felt longer. The car was filled with things left unsaid. Matthew looked out the window the entire time, watching the streetlights pass. Zach didn't speak. When they reached Matthew's building, Zach finally said, "Do you want me to come up?" Matthew looked at him for a long time. "Not tonight." Zach nodded. "Okay." Matthew got out and walked to the door without looking back. Inside his apartment, everything looked the same, but it didn't feel the same. The stillness felt sharper now, not comforting. He stood in the middle of the room for a long time, not moving. The next morning, he packed a small bag and booked a ride to his parents' house. He didn't call ahead, just showed up. His mother opened the door and smiled like nothing was unusual. "You're early for the weekend," she joked. Then she stepped aside. "Come in." He stayed quiet during dinner. She didn't push. But after the dishes were done, she sat down beside him on the couch and asked, "Is something going on?" Matthew nodded. She waited. "I've been seeing someone," he said. "Sort of." Her eyes softened. She didn't look surprised. "Zach," he added. Still no surprise. She reached over and took his hand. "Okay. I'm not sure what's happening anymore," he admitted. It started to feel like something real. But then we were around other people, and it was like none of it ever existed. He's scared. I get that. But it hurt. She didn't try to fix it. She just let him speak. "I'm not angry at him," Matthew said. "But I think I need space. Just to remember who I am when I'm not trying to make myself small for someone else's comfort." She squeezed his hand. "That's not selfish. I don't want to leave him behind. You're not, she said. You're just letting him figure out whether he wants to walk beside you for real. He stayed a few days, went for walks, read old books, sat with his thoughts. Zach texted once. I'm sorry. I didn't mean for that night to go the way it did. I miss you. Matthew didn't respond. Not because he didn't care, but because he did. And because sometimes the hardest thing is waiting while someone else figures out who they're willing to be when no one's watching. He wasn't closing the door. He just wasn't holding it open anymore. Not until Zach reached for the handle himself. Matthew didn't know what he was expecting, but it wasn't peace. He had come home for space, for quiet, maybe for something as simple as a pause in the noise. But what he found was steadiness, not from the place itself, but from being allowed to exist without explanation. His mother didn't ask questions at first. She welcomed him with a soft smile, gave him the same room he had always stayed in, and let him settle. There was no pressure to fill the silence. That mattered more than she likely realized. The days passed slowly, not painfully, just slowly enough to let things rise to the surface. He woke early, helped around the kitchen, went for walks without his phone. He sat on the back porch in the afternoons and watched the trees bend with the wind, not thinking much at all. And for the first time in a long while, he wasn't chasing answers. He was letting them come. His mother noticed, of course, the way he sat still for longer than usual, the way he looked like he wanted to speak but kept waiting for the right moment. She didn't force it. On the third evening, after dinner and before the quiet of night took over, she found him sitting outside again. She brought him a cup of tea, set it down beside him, then sat in the chair across from his. The air was soft, but not heavy. They stayed like that for a while, the only sound coming from the distant road and the occasional bird still awake. Then, without turning to look, she asked, "Do you want to talk about what brought you here?" Matthew nodded. "I think so." She waited. "I've been close to someone," he said. "Closer than I expected. And it's not new, but it's been growing. Quietly. And lately, it felt like something real." Her voice didn't change. "Someone we know?" "You've heard his name," Matthew said. "Zach. He's been around for years." She took that in without flinching. "I always thought he was important to you." Matthew glanced over. "You did, of course. You always looked more settled when he was nearby." He didn't answer right away. That part hit deeper than he expected. "I think I let myself believe we were building something. Slowly, carefully. But the moment we stepped into a room with other people, he shut it off. Acted like nothing had ever happened. Like I was just another familiar face." She was quiet again. Then she said, "And you weren't ready for that." "I wasn't," Matthew admitted. "I understand fear. I understand not knowing how to explain yourself. But it felt like I was a race to make space for his comfort." His mother nodded once. "That hurts." "It does." Matthew looked down at his hands. "I didn't come here to complain. I just needed to stop shrinking around him. I needed to remember what it feels like to breathe fully." "That's not complaining," she said. "That's survival." That made something loosen in his chest. He allowed a slow breath. "You know, I spent a long time wondering how you'd react if I ever told you something like this." She smiled faintly. "I'm glad you didn't start with fear. You started with truth." Matthew swallowed. "I thought you might be disappointed." "Why?" He shrugged. "Because I wasn't sure I knew how to explain it. Because it doesn't look like anything simple. It's not a label. It's not a phase. It's not a clean sentence. It's just me." His mother didn't move. Didn't blink away the moment. "I never needed it to be simple," she said. "I just needed you to be safe. And honest. And yours." Matthew blinked quickly. Looked out over the yard again. "Zach isn't a bad person. He's just scared. I've seen him try to be better. I've felt it. But when it mattered most, he chose comfort. And I chose to disappear for a little while instead of begging to be visible." "You chose you," she said. "I think I did. That's not weakness. That's strength, learning how to stand." They sat in silence after that. A different kind of silence. The healing kind. The kind that comes after being seen. Later, back inside, Matthew found himself looking at old things, books he once read, photos tucked into drawers, notes he wrote and forgot. It wasn't nostalgia exactly. It was more like reassurance. A quiet reminder that he had been someone before all of this, and he still was. That night, he slept deeper than he had in weeks. In the morning, he woke early again. The sun wasn't fully up yet. He poured himself coffee and stood by the window, the world still half asleep outside. Something inside him had settled. Not completely, but enough. He checked his phone. No new messages. He wasn't sure what he was waiting for. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. Later that afternoon, he went for a walk again. Same route. Same quiet. But it felt less heavy now. His steps steadier. His thoughts less tangled. He passed the corner where he used to ride his bike as a kid. Saw the spot he fell once and cried. Not because he was hurt, but because no one saw it happen. He remembered that strange ache of being alone in pain. How different that felt now. He wasn't alone. Not really. Even if Zach wasn't ready, Matthew wasn't abandoned. He had people. He had himself. That night, his mother found him outside again. "I don't want you to feel like you have to figure it all out at once," she said gently. "I don't," Matthew replied. "But I needed to know I wasn't broken for needing more than someone could give." "You're not broken. You're just no longer willing to shrink." He didn't need to say much else. Before bed, Matthew sat with his thoughts and realized he wasn't angry anymore. Disappointed, yes. Still uncertain, sure. But no longer bitter. That was something. Zach had messaged again. This time, "I'm still trying. I don't know how to do this yet, but I haven't stopped thinking about it. About you." Matthew read it twice, then set the phone down. He didn't answer. Not because he was done, but because he wasn't ready to move again until he felt like he could do so without losing himself. The healing didn't come in a grand moment. It came slowly, in the way he sat taller at the table, in the way he looked at his reflection and didn't feel like explaining who he was to himself anymore, in how he no longer rehearsed what he'd say if someone questioned him. He wasn't building armor. He was just standing without apology. That was enough for now. It had been over a week since the last message. A quiet, respectful distance had settled between them. Not hostile, not final. Just space, necessary space. So when he opened the door that afternoon and saw Zach standing there, backpack slung over one shoulder, eyes unsure but steady, Matthew's breath caught for a moment. "I didn't know if you'd be here," Zach said. "I didn't know if you'd come." Zach nodded. "I almost didn't." Matthew didn't move, didn't invite him in, but he didn't close the door either. Zach looked tired, but not defeated. He stood without shifting, as if he'd decided something on the drive over and didn't want to second-guess it now. "I told my parents," he said. Matthew blinked. "What?" "Last night. I told them. Not just about me. About you." The words landed softly, but they shook something loose in Matthew's chest. Zach continued, his voice calm but heavy. "It didn't go perfectly, but it went. I didn't lie. I didn't soften it." Matthew didn't ask what they said. He didn't need to. The story wasn't about their reaction. It was about the fact that Zach had finally spoken. "You didn't text," Matthew said after a moment. "I didn't want to say it in writing. I wanted you to hear it." Matthew stepped back. "Come in." They sat at the kitchen table, the same one where Matthew had shared tea with his mother a few nights ago. Zach set his bag on the floor, but didn't touch it again. For a while, neither of them spoke. Not because they didn't have anything to say, but because too much had built up to rush. Zach broke the silence. "I've been thinking a lot. About what I did that night. About what I didn't do." Matthew waited. "I was afraid," Zach said. "Not just of what people would think, but of what would change if I let myself show up fully. What I might lose." He looked at Matthew then. Not in passing. Not timid. Clear. "And I lost you anyway. Because I held back." Matthew nodded slowly. "You didn't lose me. But you did disappear on me when I needed you present." Zach looked down. "I know. I wasn't asking for a spotlight," Matthew said. "I wasn't trying to claim anything. I just wanted to be seen. Not denied." Zach exhaled. "I thought if I could keep things quiet, I could protect it." "Sometimes silence doesn't protect anything," Matthew replied. "Sometimes it just makes the other person feel small." Zach ran his fingers along the edge of the table. "I didn't realize how much you were holding for me. Until you stopped." Matthew looked out the window for a moment. "You came here," he said. "I didn't know if I should. I didn't come to fix everything. I just came because I wanted to stand in front of you as the person I should have been from the start." Matthew didn't respond. Zach added, "I don't expect anything from you. I'm not asking you to fall back into something. I just needed you to know that I see it now. All of it. And I don't want to run anymore." They sat with that for a long moment. "I'm not angry," Matthew said. "Not now. but I needed that space. Not because I was punishing you, because I was finding the version of me that doesn't bend to someone else's pace. Zach nodded. You shouldn't have to. There was something different in Zach now. Not polished, not perfect, but stripped down, honest. They walked later that evening. Familiar streets, same old trees, the local diner sign flickering near the corner. They didn't hold hands. They didn't need to. The air between them had changed. At one point, Zach glanced over. I've walked this road with you so many times. It always felt easy. Matthew nodded. Because it was, until it wasn't. Zach slowed his pace slightly, letting the silence return. Then he said, when we first met, I used to think you were the quiet one. But now I think you just never needed noise to prove who you were. I was quiet because I didn't trust the world to hear me, Matthew said. Not until I learned how to hear myself first. Zach looked over again. I want to learn that too. Matthew stopped walking. Zach stopped beside him. Matthew said, I can't promise we're picking up where we left off. I'm not asking for that, Zach said. I'm asking if you believe we still have somewhere to go. The street was empty. The city was winding down for the night. Everything felt paused. Matthew looked at Zach for a long time. I think we do, he said finally. But it has to be together. Not me waiting for you. Not you hiding from it. Zach swallowed. Together. They kept walking. Nothing dramatic happened. There was no music. No cinematic ending. Just two people choosing not to walk apart anymore. When they reached Matthew's door again, Zach hesitated. Can I stay tonight? Matthew didn't answer right away. He thought about the last few weeks. The pain. The silence. The clarity. Then he nodded. Yeah, you can. That night, they didn't talk about the past. They didn't make plans for the future. They just sat side by side, the kind of closeness that doesn't demand anything. And when they turned off the lights, it wasn't a new beginning. It was a return. Not to what was, but to what could still be.